Well, hello there again. I am Pastor of Victory Baptist Church, Joshua Summer, and I'm so glad that you guys are able to join me for this second session concerning New Covenant Theology. In the last installment of this session, of this course, we talked about, in the introduction, we talked about a definition of New Covenant Theology. We talked about its difficulty, or the difficulty that we have in defining New Covenant Theology because of its its relative youthfulness, we could say. It's a pretty young position. So it's difficult to define. There's no creedal statement or official statement where a bunch of New Covenant theologians have come together and defined their position. So all we can do really is take examples from different works, and I mentioned a few of those in the introduction, and go with those. And so we talked about a few claims earlier in the introduction concerning what New Covenant theologians make. We talked about the claim that Jesus intensifies the law. We looked at problems with that claim. We concluded that Jesus did not intensify the law. He fulfilled the law. That is, he perfectly fulfilled that which was commanded. He perfectly obeyed that which was already required. And Jesus exposits for us. He doesn't change by way of amplifying the law. He exposits for us really the true weight of what the law has already been. And we looked at that by contrast, or actually comparing, not contrasting, but comparing places like Matthew 22 and Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, to Deuteronomy 10, and seeing really that Jesus had just repeated what was already there in the earliest chapters of the Scriptures, in the earliest books of the Scriptures, that is Deuteronomy. Today we're going to begin drilling down deeper into what we call New Covenant theology, and we're going to look at the relationship to the law and to the covenant. And when I say the covenant, I mean the Old Covenant. What's the relationship of the law to the Old Covenant? We'll just abbreviate with OC. What's the relationship between these two things? Now, what you will notice in a lot of New Covenant theology literature is that they will say, well, since this Old Covenant is done away with, the unit that is God's law, remember we said that how they teach that the law must be a unit. There is no threefold division in the law. All of it's the one gigantic corpus of legal literature, and so it all has to. If some of it goes, it all goes. And for the New Covenant theology adherent, they would say, well, since the Old Covenant is done away with, something we would all agree with, by the way, the Old Covenant has passed away, right? Since the Old Covenant has passed away, so has the law, or at least what we might call the moral law, even the Ten Commandments, because it's all one unit, again. Even the Ten Commandments has passed away with this passing of the Old Covenant. That's their claim. But I want to look at that claim a little closer, and I want to drill down to see if it's really a valid claim. Now, we need to ask the question, when did the Old Covenant begin? Now, for the New Covenant theology crowd, I believe they would say that the Old Covenant began with the covenant of Sinai, or the covenant made with Israel at Sinai. That is what we would often call the Mosaic covenant. So the Old Covenant just is the Mosaic covenant. Okay? Now, in a sense, this is true. It's true in one sense that the Old Covenant really comes to its fullest expression in the Mosaic covenant. But really, it gets its seed, it begins really with the Abrahamic covenant and with the covenant of circumcision given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 17. And why do I say that? Why would I say that the Old Covenant begins with the Abrahamic covenant? Well, it's because both the Mosaic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant, I'll just abbreviate Abra-Cov and Mos-Cov, these are both founded upon the same basis, What is that basis? They're both founded on the basis of works or obedience, we might say. Now, this work, the fundamental work that is common to both of these covenants, is circumcision. Now, you'll notice in the Abrahamic covenant, circumcision is what brings someone into the covenant, allows someone to persist within the covenant. If someone's not circumcised, if you see in Genesis 17, they will be cut off from their people. And that stipulation does not go away for the Mosaic covenant. So the Mosaic covenant didn't abrogate the Abrahamic covenant or the covenant of circumcision. It didn't get rid of that stipulation of circumcision. It just added to that stipulation of circumcision. So in another sense, we would say that the Abrahamic covenant, or the covenant of circumcision, Stephen calls it in Acts, actually is what began the Old Covenant, okay? And it began the Old Covenant because it really included the first stipulation that is common across the board within the Old Covenant, and that is circumcision. Okay, so we would say that it began in the Abrahamic covenant. Now, that would mean that the law doesn't necessarily hinge upon the Mosaic covenant. Right? If the Old Covenant actually begins in the Abrahamic covenant, you have people obeying God in the Abrahamic covenant, it doesn't necessarily mean that with the doing away of the Mosaic covenant that all the law goes away, right? At the very least, it assumes that there's some kind of a distinction between God's standard of righteousness for these people and then the expanded standard of righteousness, or the expanded covenant stipulations for these people here, because here you have the ceremonial and civil laws given. You don't have those here, okay? So there is a distinction here. And so just because the Mosaic covenant goes away doesn't mean that the laws, the standards of God's righteousness that the people were obeying here goes away. And I actually want to go further than that and say that even before the Abrahamic covenant, and not maybe before and after, slightly after the Abrahamic covenant, we can find all 10 laws within the 10 commandments of the Mosaic covenant exemplified. Okay? So in other words, God's people were living according to the 10 commandments prior to the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. Now, why is that so important? Why is that important? Well, the claim within New Covenant theology circles is that the law, again, the 10 commandments, they rise or fall with the rise or fall of the Old Covenant, or what they would say is the Mosaic covenant. In other words, the Mosaic covenant represents the giving of the law, and the doing away of the Mosaic covenant represents the doing away of the law. So the law becomes, the 10 commandments, becomes totally dependent upon the Mosaic covenant. But if those 10 commandments existed before, or if they could be exemplified prior to the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, then it means the 10 commandments do not depend on the Mosaic covenant for their continued existence. And so that's what I want to look at today. I want to look at all of and I'll get rid of this to make us some room. I want to look at all the commandments. I want to look at all the places those commandments are exemplified. And so we're going to begin with the first commandment. Okay? That's commandment number 1. No other gods. And where do we find that exemplified prior to the giving of the law? Now, I'm saying exemplified for a reason. I'm not saying that these are commandments formally given prior to the law, right, where they're codified there at the giving of the Mosaic covenant. I'm saying that they're exemplified in that people were obeying these laws prior to the giving of the law at Sinai. So look with me at Genesis chapter 3, verse 5. Genesis chapter 3, verse 5. In a lot of ways, this first commandment is violated in the first transgression. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 5, the serpent says to the woman, "For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Now, he's not saying that you'll be like God in the sense that you're already the image of God, but he's saying that you will achieve something of God's status. You will know, just as God does, good from evil. So it's a self-idolatrous disposition already that Satan is encouraging in the woman. And that is a violation, obviously, of no other gods, the first commandment, right? And so it's exemplified there. It's exemplified in other areas of Genesis as well. Now I'm going back to some of the earliest portions of the Scriptures in Genesis. Now I want to look at the second commandment. The second commandment. No graven images. Okay? No graven images. I spelled graven wrong. That's... Okay. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 35. Genesis chapter 35, verse 2. It's Genesis chapter 35, verse 2. "And Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, 'Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves and change your garments.'" Now, what he's talking about is he's talking about the idols that are among them. He's saying, put them away. We already see that there's an unkind disposition in the Old Testament, earliest chapters of the Old Testament, against graven images, against idolatry. And these two are very closely related, although with two different emphases. And so we see that exemplified there in Genesis 35. Can you still see that? Yep. "Thou shalt not take the Lord your God's name in vain." But look with me in chapter 24, verse 5. It says, "And the servant said to him, 'Perhaps the woman will not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I take your son back to the land from which you..." Oh, I'm sorry. Look with me in Genesis chapter 24, verse 3. "And I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell." There's no higher standard by which a person could swear an oath. There's no higher name a person could use. And so it follows that since there's no higher name a person can use, that you don't vainly carry the name of the Lord your God on your lips. You carry the name of God on your lips intentionally and reverently, according to his very will. Now let's look at the fourth commandment. This is perhaps the most debated commandment, and the commandment perhaps that this entire debate revolves around, and that is the Sabbath. And that's remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, right? In Genesis or in Exodus 20, that's what the commandment is. But let's look at Exodus 5. Exodus 5, we will see in Exodus 5, verse 3 and 4, "So they said, 'The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the desert and sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword.' Then the king of Egypt said to them, 'Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people from their work? Get back to your labor.' And Pharaoh said, 'Look, the people of the land are many now, and you make them rest from their labor.'" The reason the Israelites wanted to go out from the Egyptians into the desert was so that they could rest from their labor. There's already some kind of Sabbath being observed here, and we see that there's a Sabbath being observed in Exodus 16, 4 chapters prior to the giving of the law in Exodus 20. But let's look at the commandment itself in Exodus 20. because the nature of the commandment itself is significant for our purposes here. It begins in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore, okay, it's concluding, therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now keep in mind, the commandment begins by calling the Israelites to remember something. Remember the Sabbath day. That is, remember that which has already existed. There's already something there that has existed prior to the giving of the law that the Israelites are now called to remember back to. And then it says, keep it holy. Continue to keep it holy. Don't forget about it. Remember it. And don't only remember it, but keep it holy. And then what's it do in verse 11? It grounds the Sabbath commandment in what? In God's rest. And so we see that there is a Sabbath that existed prior to the giving of the law. And so the Sabbath does not rise or fall with the rise or fall of the Mosaic covenant. It's independent of it, yet included in it. Okay? There's a difference between being independent of the Mosaic covenant, yet included in the Mosaic covenant, and being totally dependent on the Mosaic covenant such that the Mosaic covenant goes away and the Sabbath and the law goes away. Okay? We would say that the Ten Commandments are independent of the Mosaic covenant, yet included in the Mosaic covenant stipulation. Okay, now let's look at the fifth commandment. None of these other commandments should really be controversial to you, but let's look at the fifth commandment. That is, we know, honor parents. And applied consistently, that would be honor those who are in authority over you at any given point in time. And we can go to Genesis chapter 9 to see this. Genesis chapter 9, verse 20 through 27. Verse 20 through 27. And Noah began to be a farmer, and he planted a vineyard. Then he drank of the wine, and he was drunk and became uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. So Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done to him. That is, Ham shamed him. And so what Noah did was he cursed Ham for his reaction to his nakedness. Ham was not honoring his father at that point, and so Ham was cursed for that. And so that's an example of the fifth commandment, or the substance of the fifth commandment. The spirit of the fifth commandment is alive prior to the giving of the law of Moses. Now let's look at the sixth commandment, which is no murder. No murder, right? This should not be a debated commandment as to whether or not it exists for all times and all places. But just for the sake of consistency, let's look at Cain's curse in Genesis 4. In Genesis 4, we see that Cain kills his brother and then is cursed for that. So if you look at Genesis chapter 4, verse 9, then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Verse 10, and he said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." Cain was punished for murdering his brother. Now let's look at the seventh commandment. The seventh commandment. No adultery. No adultery. If you turn with me to Genesis chapter 2, Genesis chapter 2, verses 23 through 25, we see what Adam says when he receives woman for the first time. And Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." A man, a woman shall be joined together, never to be separated, so intimately so that they become one flesh. Brothers and sisters, adultery has been wrong from the beginning. Let's look at the eighth commandment. The eighth commandment, which is what? No stealing. No stealing. Now I'll just mention this. We won't have to go and read the entire passage, but in Genesis chapter 44, you have the whole fiasco with Joseph's cup, and the sin of stealing is really looked upon negatively there in that instance as well. So you could look at Genesis chapter 44 and see how see the reactions to theft in that particular chapter, and see that theft was not a good thing prior to the giving of the law. It was wrong to steal prior to the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. Now let's look at the ninth commandment. No false witness. Thou shalt not bear false witness, right? And this should be obvious to us that it was binding prior to the Mosaic covenant. But let's look at Genesis chapter 27. Genesis chapter 27, verse 12. "Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be a deceiver to him, and I shall bring a curse on myself and not a blessing." Now, this is Jacob, and he is basically saying that if I deceive my father, I'll be cursed, right? Because deception, lying, twisting the truth, bearing false witness, I spelled false wrong, bearing false witness has never been a good thing. It's never been something that has been permissible since the very beginning. We see that exemplified. And now let's look at the 10th commandment. No covetousness. Handwriting gets worse the lower I go. Look at Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. Covetousness was one of the first sins committed. Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. See what the motivation is. "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant, desirable," there was lust there, pleasant to the eyes, "and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate as well." And so, brothers and sisters, you see the very motivation for the first command, or the first sin, was covetousness. And I hope this is helpful in showing you that at least all of these commandments, especially the Sabbath commandment, actually, more often than I can find more examples of the Sabbath day almost being observed than some of these other ones. And I just wanted to show all of you that these commandments are all exemplified, each and every one of them exemplified in the Scriptures prior to the giving of the Mosaic covenant, which means that these commandments do not rise or fall based on the rise and fall or fall of the Mosaic covenant. They do not depend on the Mosaic covenant for their existence, but the Mosaic covenant, God in the Mosaic covenant included these commands within it. So if the Mosaic covenant is done away with, it doesn't therefore follow that all these commandments are done away with, and then we have to look for positive reaffirmations or positive repetitions in the New Covenant or in the New Testament. So I hope this has been helpful to you. If you guys have any questions, please let us know in the comments section here on YouTube, or you can even get on the church website and send an email to the church email there on the front page.